Good morning. It's great to have you with us again as we explore this whole theme of avoiding the drift. I want to begin by asking you whether you are a creature of habit. We've all got habits, I guess. We've all got bad habits. And if you're at home with a spouse, I'm sure that you are more than aware of one another's bad habits. But we also have good habits in our lives, things that we do routinely, rhythmically, that actually enhance our life and promote health and happiness and long-term fruitfulness as well. Habits, they can appear on one level very innocuous, can't they, and insignificant in the big scheme of our lives, but they are having the potential to have an impact on our long-term trajectory. Now, I'm not talking about habits like leaving the cap off the toothpaste tube. I'm sure none of you do that. I'm talking about the patterns and rhythms and routines of our lives, the things that we allocate time to, things we prioritize in terms of the ordinary course of our lives. These routines, these habits, these rhythms may appear insignificant and innocuous, but they are important. And they can have a massive impact on the long-term trajectory of our lives, like a few small clicks in terms of a course direction in the middle of the ocean. Extended over the long term can mean that a vessel, as we've said, can end up significantly off course. They may not appear to make any difference in the short term, but extend the timeline, and the reality is that inevitably they will lead to some major long-term changes. Well, to some degree, for all of us over the last 6 months, the rhythm or the routines, the habits in our lives have been disrupted. For some, they've been turned upside down. For others, there's been minor adjustments. I want to encourage you, as we begin to think this morning about church drift, to think about what are the habits in the last 6 months that you have gotten out of, that were part of your rhythm and routine of life before the pandemic and the lockdown as a result of the pandemic, and what new habits perhaps have you adopted? Just think for a moment about that. And now extend the timeline. Where are those old routines that have been abandoned, or those new routines that have been adopted, heading in the long term if you extend the timeline? We're thinking about the very real danger at the moment of spiritual drift occurring in our lives as a result of what is a very challenging season for all of us. And I want to talk about church drift this morning. And by that I mean the very real danger of becoming increasingly distant and disconnected and less engaged as a participating member of the local church community that God's placed us in. That is a very real danger at the moment, and in one sense it's possibly one of the most complex areas that we're looking at to think through and to deal with and to know how to respond to. It's complex for a number of reasons. First of all, because there is, of course, something of an inevitability about church drift at the moment. We perhaps feel that we can do something about our own kind of vitality in terms of being preoccupied with Jesus, our own confidence and conviction of truth itself. But when it comes to our connection with the church, that can seem much more of a conundrum. It can seem, for very obvious reasons, much harder to get to grips with and to address. In the light of the challenges that we're all facing and the restrictions we're having to function within, there is, of course, in some sense, no way that we can avoid some measure of drift. That's just the way in which God's designed us and the way in which our spiritual health works. But we can wrongly then decide that we will just pull up the oars, if you like, and go with the drift. That there is no point rowing against this current of church drift. And as a result, we decide that we'll just go with it for as long as it lasts, that there's no point trying to row against the current, and that we don't really feel like we're getting anywhere anyway, and it's exhausting and it's hard work. That it's better just to pull up the oars and wait until we hit the shore some point in the future. Well, we may not be able to avoid some measure of drift that is inevitable in terms of a sense of distance and disconnection from one another and from Jesus' church at this time. But I believe we can, to some degree, mitigate against it, and should, to some degree, be doing whatever we possibly can to mitigate against that kind of drift. We can't avoid drift, but we can mitigate against it. It's also difficult and something of a complex situation because we are all, of course, in a range of situations, and I want to acknowledge that as we think through this. We're not all equally impacted by the situation. Some, of course, have more freedom than others to mitigate the risk of church drift. Some want to meet and can meet. Some want to meet but can't meet for very obvious and valid reasons. Some don't want to meet despite the fact that they can meet. And all of that, of course, was reflected in our recent survey. And that means, of course, that there is no one size fits all in terms of how we should be responding and mitigating against church drift at the moment. There's no single prescription for each one of us. God's prescription for you will be different than his prescription for me. So this isn't a rallying call to join us, for example, at our in-person meetings. For some, of course, that wouldn't be appropriate. What it is, however, is a call for us to wake up at this time to the very real danger of church drift occurring, and for us to keep the oars in the water and find God's solution for us in our given situation. To avoid a situation where we're just pulling up the oars and seeing where we end up when all this is over. This is also complex because we find ourselves in a very different situation, a very different kind of context. For the last 6 months, we have entered into the world of online church. We're there again this morning. In the process, what's happened is that our church gatherings, having gone online, have become much harder to engage with, much less involving, and as a result, much less beneficial to us spiritually. Many of the usual parameters by which we were used to in terms of navigating our engagement with church have evaporated. Think of the geographical parameters that have now evaporated. We can attend church anywhere in the world at the moment, online, at the click of a button. That's a new parameter. We're no longer thinking in terms, perhaps, of where is reachable geographically. There's no longer, of course, along with that, any responsibility. There's no longer a master rota. You may be pleased to hear that. So we're not on serving teams. There's no expectations over us to engage, to serve, to be involved, to play our part as contributing members of our local church community. And so this all makes the whole issue of church quite challenging. I want to recognize that. I want to flag up the danger of drift. And I do want to encourage some response. But as I do that, I'm very aware that this is complex. And I want to avoid suggesting that there's some kind of, one-size-fits-all application. And I trust that you'll hear my heart, and that through this, the Spirit will speak to you. And if perhaps you have pulled up the oars and just waiting to see how this all settles at any point in the future when it might come to an end, not to do that, to get some oars back in the water and to do what you can to mitigate against what I'm calling church drift. And once again, we're going to root this in the context of Hebrews. The first thing to recognize is that This is all very much tied up with what we have already looked at in terms of areas of drift in our lives. You see, the Bible doesn't divide our own personal devotion to Jesus as disciples and our own individual spiritual health and our involvement and engagement as participating members of the local church. Those things go hand in hand. The New Testament assumption and the assumption of Hebrews is that to be a disciple is to be a participant in the life and community of the local church. There's no such thing as discipleship outside of the context of church community and church life. Following Jesus isn't some kind of solo adventure. Now, it may feel a little bit like that for you at the moment, but it's not. It's something we do together. We can't do the things that the Bible commands us to do as disciples without being then a participating member of a local church community. Drifting in terms of our devotion to and enthusiasm for Jesus, and drifting in terms of our active engagement with his church go hand in glove. We must understand that. Vision drift then and church drift are two sides of the same coin. If you begin to drift in terms of your devotion to Jesus, you will eventually begin to drift in terms of your active participation in the life and community of his church. And if you drift from the life of the church, you will find it all the more of a challenge to maintain an enthusiasm for Jesus. And that's why so many of us are feeling so spiritually depleted at this time. And Hebrews, whilst it speaks a lot about keeping our eyes on Jesus, and the writer reminds us of the compelling glory of Jesus and his finished work on our behalf, also speaks about not neglecting what it means to be participating members of Jesus' church. The context of Hebrews involves a few things. Let me mention a couple. First of all, the whole issue that the writer's addressing of personal neglect. That seems to be something of the context that he's writing into. For one reason or another, these Christians have become just a bit lazy about certain things, certain aspects of their lives. So there's a personal neglect that's part of the context. But there's also, alongside of that, an issue for the Hebrew Christians of personal safety. They're living, it seems, with a very real threat of persecution. To do the things that the writer encourages them to do involve taking personal risks. To identify as a Christian, to associate with Jesus' church in the ways the writer encourages them to, was to put themselves in a place of personal danger. So what do we learn here about how we mitigate against church drift? First thing that we are warned not to neglect is gathering to worship. Let me read from Hebrews chapter 10 and note the words that I have underlined. This is what the writer says: "Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have boldness to enter the sanctuary through the blood of Jesus, he has inaugurated for us a new and living way through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. And since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold on to the confession of our hope without wavering, since he who promised is faithful. And let us consider one another in order to provoke love and good works, not neglecting," there's that word, "to gather together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging each other, and all the more as you see the day approaching." Here the writer addresses the need to avoid drift in terms of our ability to gather together to worship. He's warning them against not neglecting to gather to worship, as some, it seems, had fallen into the habit of doing. And he mentions positively a number of things that occur when we do gather in that way to worship. There's a drawing near, there's a stirring up, there's a holding fast, there's a provoking of one another to love and good deeds, and there's an encouraging of one another. That happens as we pursue and participate in a regular rhythm of gathering together to worship. Now, it doesn't mean, of course, that every meeting we attend deepens our intimacy with Jesus and stirs us and encourages and strengthens us every time we turn up. Let's face it, some meetings are better than other meetings, and some are more effective than others. But what it does mean is that as we pursue this as a regular rhythm in our lives, we create and put ourselves in a context where these things occur. And we are desperately missing that, aren't we? What I've observed myself personally is that the higher my level of heart engagement and contribution within the context of those gatherings, the more I find myself blessed and enjoying those kind of benefits that the writer mentions as a result. So the writer's encouraging them not to neglect this. Now, our challenge in this season is that our worship gatherings are harder to engage with and are less rewarding. That's just the nature of online church. We've referred to it like dehydrated food. It may have all the ingredients written on the packet, but it's a powdered version of the real thing. And it can be hard to keep on coming back to that. Our in-person gatherings that we are launching and beginning, they may be more like the real thing in some ways, but in other ways, they lack some vital ingredients, like sung worship and close fellowship with one another. Well, the reality is, of course, that for the foreseeable future, we're going to have to exist on this blend of powdered church and in-person church that lacks some key ingredients. That means that the danger of church drift is probably more real in our lives than at any other time. The temptation to pull up the oars then and disengage, and as a result drift, is massive for every one of us. So how are you doing when it comes to gathering with the church to worship? You may even have given up on it. In what ways are your rhythms and habits changed, perhaps, over the last 6 months with regard to this? What does it mean for you? What does it mean for your family? How about if you extend the timeline over another 6 months, another 12 months? First area not to neglect is our gathering to worship. We're going to think in a little while about some principles about how we maintain that given the context that we're currently in. The second area not to neglect is practicing hospitality. Hebrews 13 says, don't neglect, there's the word again, to show hospitality. For by doing this, some have welcomed angels as guests without knowing it. Remember those in prison, as though you were in prison with them, and the mistreated as though you yourselves were suffering bodily. Here's that word, neglect, again. It seems here that the Christians that the writer's addressing were not only neglecting to meet with others to worship, but were also neglecting their contact with other Christians more generally, outside of the context of their worship gatherings. When you read in between the lines in Hebrews, it's clear that they were living, as I said, with a very real threat if they were to maintain those contacts. The threat of persecution as a result of their identification with Jesus and his church. And it was leading, it seems, to a voluntary disassociation. They were closing their doors to other Christians who had quite possibly been displaced and were homeless. They were neglecting to visit members of the church who had been arrested and imprisoned. Why? Well, out of fear that they themselves would become the target of persecution, it seems. As a result, they were keeping their distance. And the writer urges them not to do that. Urges them to practice hospitality, to visit those in prison. You see, when we understand that the church is a community, not a meeting, but a family, hospitality and visiting those that are isolated becomes very much an important part of what it means to be disciples. Hospitality is, of course, at the very heart of church life in the New Testament. Here it may have meant opening your doors and providing lodging for persecuted Christians who were homeless and displaced. But more generally, it refers to the regular rhythm and practice of opening up our hearts and our homes to others in order to advance the gospel, in order to promote the health and well-being of the church. That may mean all sorts of things. It may mean providing lodging for displaced people, but it may be more simple and straightforward than that. It may mean just sitting round a table sharing a meal. It may mean taking someone out for coffee with a view to giving them some encouragement and support. And the writer says, look, don't neglect this. And then there's visiting prisoners, visiting and giving support to those who were isolated, which essentially is what being a prisoner involves. Now, I'm guessing there are not many people that we know who are locked up because of their faith in Jesus. But there are, of course, at the moment, some who are to some degree imprisoned in their homes as a result of the pandemic and the measures that are in place. It may be the result of age or disability. It may be that there's a requirement on them to self-isolate. It's been so good and encouraging to hear examples of folk in the church community in those kind of situations, being called, being visited, being supported. And I want to encourage us, let's continue to ensure that we do that. So once again here, this really does need wisdom as we navigate it. We're living with some very real restrictions, and behind that some very real risks, different to the risks that the writer's addressing here, but some very real risks to personal health, to the health of our families. We've got legal restrictions that need to be acknowledged and I believe obeyed. And behind those legal requirements, there is of course the very real responsibility that we do what Jesus said, which is to love our neighbour and our community. But alongside that, we also have these very real biblical commands not to neglect things like hospitality and to neglect visiting those that are isolated, that we have to take seriously. Danger on the one hand is that we act recklessly and in defiance, which is not appropriate, and that we put ourselves or others at unnecessary risk. But the danger on the other hand is that we end up neglecting some things that are pretty important when it comes to being participating members of a church. I want to suggest some principles that I hope will help shortly as we find our way through that. So let me just ask, first of all, how are you doing when it comes to hospitality and supporting those who are isolated? I'm not encouraging you to flout rules and be reckless, but there are perhaps some possibilities for some form of hospitality that some of us maybe are not making the most of. I know there are individuals that are isolated that you're aware of. What can you do to give them encouragement and support? Third and final area is expressing generosity. Chapter 13, verse 16, don't neglect to do good, to do what is good, and to share, for God's pleased with such sacrifices. Here again is that word. It pops up, doesn't it, frequently in Hebrews, neglect. As the writer addresses the danger of drift in their lives, this is another thing he warns against and neglecting. Doing good and sharing in a way that is sacrificial. That's a good definition of biblical generosity. And once again, it's at the heart of New Testament church. It's what we find happening, of course, in the book of Acts, land and property being sold to meet the needs of others so that there were no needy persons among them. But here, for these Christians, it was something that it seems that they were to some degree beginning to neglect for one reason or another. And the reality is, of course, whenever we pass through challenging, uncertain, unpredictable seasons, it's an area we can begin to neglect. It's the way in which such seasons lead to some bizarre forms of self-centeredness and self-preservation if we're not careful. In an extreme, they can lead to a bunker mindset. That's, of course, why we find people hoarding things like toilet roll and other things like sugar. I mean, of all the non-essentials in life. Why? because there's a tendency in uncertain times to turn in on ourselves, to hunker down, to focus our protective energies on ourselves and our immediate families. The people buying toilet roll aren't buying it in order to share with others should the day come when we all run out. No, it's the opposite of that. And this is what the writer is encouraging us to resist and not neglect, to continue to do good and share with others. It's been great to see that again happening over this season in our life as a church community. Whether it's been the stepping up of your giving to offset the way in which some within our community would have suffered a drop in income and as a result have been able to give less than they would have liked. Whether it's been meals that have been cooked and delivered or shopping that's been brought. Well done. Let me encourage us not to neglect this going forward. So these are three areas that the writer highlights that we can neglect as a result of drift. Our gathering to worship, the expressing of generosity, and our practicing of hospitality. Now, let me just give a few principles as we think through how we apply this, because as I said, there's no one size fits all here. But let me suggest some principles that help us to respond and reflect on our own situation and find God's solution for us to be able to mitigate against the very real risk of church drift. Number one, I'd encourage you at this time to extend the timeline. The nature of drift is that it's not massive overnight change. It's gradual, incremental, that happens over a period of time. We make what we think are short-term adjustments to what we think is a short-term situation, but the longer the situation lasts, the more impact those short-term adjustments have upon the longer-term trajectory of our lives. Extending the timeline means we begin to approach the situation somewhat differently, not as a short-term interim time, but a more likely longer-term reality. And that involves a change in the way we think about our situation. It means that we have then to find an approach that is sustainable in terms of our own spiritual health as disciples in the long term. The short-term adjustments that we made may not be sustainable in the long term when it comes to our spiritual health. So let me ask you then, just reflect for a moment. Are there adjustments that you have made in the past 6 months, which if you extend the timeline to 12 months, to 18 months, are not sustainable in terms of your own spiritual health? What old habits perhaps have you neglected within the last 6 months, which you can't afford to neglect if you extend the timeline another 12 months, another 18 months? Maybe things like rest, maybe things like prayer, maybe things like engagement in church life and relationships. What new habits have you adopted that might become unhelpful if you extend the timeline another 12, 18 months? And in the light of that, what key adjustments do you now need to make? So that first principle is about changing the way we think about the situation. Secondly, identify opportunities and be creative. Very easy for us to be fixated on the restrictions, isn't it? Preoccupied with what we can't do under the current circumstances. And that ultimately is a very negative way of approaching the situation. It can lead to a kind of just resignation when it comes to engaging with the life and community of the church. It can lead to us, as I said, just pulling up the oars and drifting on downstream. The reality is, of course, times of crisis often lead to fresh innovations and opportunities. We find creative ways of doing church that we otherwise wouldn't perhaps consider. That's happened down through history. The church has found creative ways to meet and continue her mission through all sorts of challenges. The early church wasn't welcome to express its life together within the context of the synagogue, and so they began to meet in public spaces and in homes primarily. In the 1600s in our own nation, the Puritans were ejected from the Church of England and began to meet wherever they could. In 1664, Charles II passed an act that specified that owners of houses, outhouses, barns, yards or woods or grounds that allowed meetings to be held on their premises would be punished, suggesting that congregations were meeting in all sorts of creative ways within each of those contexts. Today, of course, in places like China, the church gathers largely underground in caves and secret basements. Now, thankfully, we're not in a situation where it's illegal to gather, but we do have certain restrictions. And we do need, I think, to think creatively about the opportunities that we have. Under the current restrictions, we can gather safely a number in our own premises at the moment with certain guidelines in place. And I believe it's right that we're making the most of that creative opportunity. There are things we can't do, but there are things we can do. We can gather as groups of up to 6 at the moment from different households within our homes, with the appropriate guidelines being followed. Let's make the most of that opportunity. That means if you're a single person and have the space, you can invite up to 5 others over with the appropriate guidelines in place. If you're a family of 4, you can invite a couple over or 2 singles over. We can, of course, meet in coffee shops, as many are meeting in coffee shops. We can grab a takeaway if we're not comfortable with that and sit outside in the park, weather permitting, or in a garden. There are all sorts of opportunities. Let's identify them. Let's make the most of them. Let's remain next flexible. Situations changing all the time. The current guidelines I've just outlined may even be out of date by the time that you are listening and watching this video. We could be back into a more severe lockdown before we know it. We don't know. The restrictions could lift sooner than we think. That's unlikely, but it might happen. What's certain is that the situation is going to continue to change, and that means that whatever we do needs to be held lightly, and we need to be flexible. And then finally, we need to be courageous. Christians that the book of Hebrews addresses were clearly living in a time of prolonged threat. For them, it was the very real threat of persecution. And for them to avoid the drift and respond in the ways the writer encourages them was going to require courage. It would take courage to practice hospitality. It would take courage to not neglect their meeting together. It would take courage to continue to share generously with those in need. That's why the need of encouragement is a feature within the letter. To encourage is to inject courage into another person. And we need that all the more at this time. We need courage to avoid the drift. We need courage to get the oar back in the water, to mitigate against church drift, to gather, to practice hospitality, to support those who are isolated, to make the most of the opportunities. So a very complex situation, and not one that I want to suggest there is a one-size-fits-all response to. Hopefully, those principles are helpful, and that by the help of God's grace and the power of His Spirit, God will give you some solutions and some ways in which you can take action to mitigate against the very real threat of church drift at this time. Let me pray. Father, we thank you for the promise that if we lack wisdom, we ask God, and He'll give it to us. We all are in very different situations. We're in a very different world, Father, with old parameters gone, and yet a very real need for us to do whatever it takes to mitigate against church drift in our lives. And so I pray for wisdom for every one of us, everyone listening and watching this video message. I pray that you would put wisdom in their hearts for their own situation, creative ways to mitigate against what feels like an inevitable drift. I pray, Father, that you would give us the grace, Lord, that when we emerge from this time, whatever that means, we might find that we haven't drifted off course in any significant way. Father, we pray, come to us, please, in Jesus' name. Amen.